Too many days in the darkness.
Welcome to Prevention is Cure, brought to you by precure.com, the podcast which brings you the latest in science and practice and challenging mainstream medicine and finding new and exciting ways of having a happier and healthy life. This series is looking specifically at mental health. We've become really concerned about the lack of translation of what science knows into what medicine does. In most societies, including the one I live in, 1 in 5 of us will have a serious mental health problem at some stage. The infrastructure, the practice, the gap between treatment and best practice is massive. This podcast series aims to do something about it. Prevention is Cure. I'm your host, Professor Grant Schofield. In this episode, I talked to Josh Darby. Josh is a career firefighter. He's a trauma and psychological injury expert. He's a philosopher, a scientist, and a critical thinker. I first met Josh a few years back through his postgraduate studies at AUT. He's since become a good friend, a colleague. We've been successful together at getting a big project with Firefighter Emergency New Zealand through Movember, funded around this area of psychological injury and wellbeing. His knowledge and lived experience around trauma and psychological injury are real, helpful, insightful. It's an area that I've learned a tremendous amount about, and frankly, as a former psychologist, surprised I knew virtually nothing about. It's really the pointy end of psychology, well-being, the idea that we're all going to be exposed to these psychological events that overwhelm us, and whether we can see our way through to post-traumatic growth, or that we stay overwhelmed and can't process and turn away, not towards facing up to what's happened, and end up with these psychological injuries and trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder and the like. Interesting. You're going to find this, if you don't know anything about the area, really interesting and really insightful. If you're already in the area, it'll take you to the next level. Enjoy.
Too many days in the darkness without a glimpse of the light. Running tired and broken and scared, but I swear I'll never give up the fight.
Okay, we're here with Josh Darby, firefighter, philosopher, scientist, practitioner. Hey, Josh.
Hey, Grant. Certainly the first thing. I don't know about all those other ones.
Yeah, right. So you've been interested in psychological injury, trauma, that sort of stuff for a while. Tell us about your history and how you came to that.
Yeah, so I mean, if we take it right back, I grew up in a little place called Kaihu. There was a river that ran around the campground that my parents built there. And so I had my first kind of time on the water catching eels. And then when I was about 8 or 9, we moved up to the Whangaparoa Peninsula, also renowned for its waters for fishing. And I was going to school at the local school there in Silverdale. And at the top of the hill was a local volunteer fire brigade. And so that was kind of my entry into service as a volunteer firefighter at that time.
As a teenager?
As a teenager, 16 years of age, the local volunteer fire brigade, they came down, they were a bit short of volunteer firefighters. And so they had this genius idea to recruit us, and that was to bring down 2 fire engines, start up a big water fight, and then get us over the line, you know. And so it worked. I mean, I was straight in there in the water fight. What really got me over the line though, and I tell this story, it's quite funny, is one of the firefighters came up to me and held a black pager up and said, Josh, if you join up, become a volunteer firefighter, you get one of these pages, and whenever it goes off, you can leave school. And I'm 16, just not loving school. And so I'm like, sweet, where do I sign up? Like,
yeah, did also mention that could happen in the middle of the night?
Well, it actually happened during my end of year exams, and I was like, went off and I was like, hallelujah, so straight out there. I can't remember what the call was, but I made sure we took the long way back, maybe stopped off at Macca's on the way home. Yeah.
And things changed in Fire Emergency New Zealand, who you still currently work for. Actually, we should get that out of the way, right? So I think we wanted to say that.
Yeah.
While you work for Fire Emergency, what you've got to say here will may not necessarily reflect.
Yeah, I'm still an operational firefighter, still with fire and emergency, but what I say is kind of my own opinion and not necessarily reflective of the organisation. Although I'm sure they agree with much of what I say. But yeah, so I was a volunteer for a couple of years until I was 18, and I actually finished school, went to university, and hated university. I got sick in my second semester. I think in part it was just I was studying something that was more of my father's interest, trying to follow in his footsteps. I hadn't really figured out at that stage what I was interested in. So I was kind of C's and D's. And fortunately, as life would have it, I got sick, couldn't finish the semester. And I was working as a pool lifeguard at the time. And my supervisor was an ex-career firefighter. He said, mate, you should give career firefighting a go, become a full-time firefighter. So yeah, I did. I applied when I was 18 and was accepted. Spent 3 months down in Rota Vegas, as we affectionately call it, and did my training as become a career firefighter. So I came off the trucks a few weeks ago to work on a secondment. So yeah, that's pretty exciting.
And the projects around the Whanaungatanga program is around wellbeing.
Absolutely, yeah. So obviously that's my background into firefighting and the job, and really enjoyed that. But yeah, my interest in well-being and psychology and what's led to what we're doing now with this project kind of came about through a whole range of reasons. One, the most uncomfortable to talk about is kind of my own experience with psychological injury. So yeah, in my mid-20s, I think I'd done a pretty good job of suppressing the trauma that I'd experienced, the potentially traumatic events I'd been exposed to.
So hang on, you're going out on calls?
Yes.
And you're turning up to what?
Well, I'm at 16 years of age. I'm going to motor vehicle accidents where there's fatalities. We're cutting people out of the car and they've passed away. Going to incidents where there's structure fires, houses or buildings, and people have lost everything. So not only you're exposed to the loss, but you're exposed to the people who have just lost everything, and that can be like quite a thing in and of itself. We often think about distress being related to the blood in the guts or the death. But quite often, at least for first responders, and we see this in some of the qualitative research, it's actually, they call it emotional aspect exposure. So you turn up and someone's lost everything, all of their memories, all of their belongings, and they're in a state of just overwhelm from that. And that can be quite hard to see.
Yeah, and they might not be insured or something. And
yeah,
that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, initially, where I was stationed, it was a lot of motor vehicle accidents. That's where most of the fatalities we're exposed to came from. I remember at 16 years of age, we went to a 2-car motor vehicle accident. They'd gone head on at about 100 kilometers an hour or over 100 kilometers an hour. And there was screaming coming from one of the cars. And so the majority of the crews went that way. And I ended up being by myself, 16 or 17 years of age, at the other car. And there was a status one, a young man, a teenager, and he was unconscious, unresponsive, not breathing. And he was just trapped by his legs. So I was trying to pull him out without any tools at that stage. And he passed away, stopped breathing while I was kind of holding on to him. So, for a 17-year-old, 16, 17-year-old, that's a big thing to kind of navigate. And I think looking back now, I just didn't have the tools to navigate that, apart from like, oh, well, this is just part of it. I'll suck it up and get on with it.
So you tend not to process it and just move to the next thing?
Or if you do process it, it's on a really superficial level. You might talk to a couple of people about it, but if any strong emotions come up, we'll shut those down. That's a bit scary. I don't want to feel that. So I'm sure there was processing that went on, but it just wasn't really sophisticated, yeah.
And so then over the 16 years, you've had more and more exposure. I think the way that they do calls in New Zealand Mets, there's been more exposure to those sorts of events more recently.
Yeah, for sure. And so in 2013, so historically firefighters have always provided some level of medical care. Obviously, if we turn up to a motor vehicle accident, if we turn up to an industrial entrapment, so someone who's been trapped in machinery, in industry, obviously at fires, sometimes people are trapped in fires, we provide first aid. That's part of our role, especially if emergency ambulance services haven't showed up yet. But for most firefighters, it wasn't a core part of our work. It's something that if St. John wanted our help, or Wellington Free, for example, they'd request it, and of course we'd provide it. But it wasn't really a formalised understanding where we'd go to medical calls. There were a few stations that did first responder work, but for the majority of career firefighters, at least, that wasn't the case. However, in 2013, start of 2014, that all changed. And the organisation signed up to a memorandum of understanding with these emergency ambulance services that said, every time there's a what they call a purple call, which is the most severe type of call, medical call you could attend, respiratory cardiac arrest, we're going to send a fire engine as well as ambulances. So not just a fire engine, we're going to send you, you're going to co-respond with ambulance to these scenarios, to these medical calls. And there's good reasoning for that. The evidence shows early CPR, early defibrillation improves outcomes for out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. And often, even if ambulance is already there, we can do that kind of grunt work, do the compressions and provide early defibrillation. And certainly as a consequence of that, they've seen an increase in survival rates for out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. Part of the problem, though, was that exponentially increased traumatic scenes for firefighters. So if we're in the district that I work in, the Auckland Central District, I think we went from attending 5 medical calls in 2013. As of 2020, I believe that number had increased to 220. So like a 4,000% increase.
So you talk about this potentially traumatic events, which has all been new language to me.
Yeah.
And coincidentally, I've just ended up with a couple of my sons being exposed to what I guess we would call potentially traumatic events. So one was just witnessing an attack by a dog on a little girl that appeared life-threatening.
Yeah.
And the other one was, attending fatality and making rescues and stuff, life-saving. And what do we mean by a potentially traumatic event, and what is that, and why do we even have that label? What is it?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think it's good to take a step back and go, well, what do we mean when we talk about trauma? What does trauma mean? And there's obviously clinical kind of definitions of trauma that you get from the DSM, which is what psychologists and psychiatrists and GPs use to help diagnose mental disorders. But I guess there's a more practical way of viewing it. And trauma comes from the Greek and translates to wound, basically. So we can experience a physical wounding, and most of us will have experienced some type of physical wounding in our life. But
you cut your hand or something.
Yeah, you cut your hand. Physical wound, right? Yeah. External force impacts, your biological organism and leaves a wound. And in the same way, you can experience a wound to your psyche, right? So psyche connotes mind, soul, and spirit. That's what it kind of translates from the Greek. So psychological trauma is a wound to the mind, soul, spirit, a wound, a mental injury. And so that's how I like to think about it. Just like we can get a physical wound or a physical injury, we can also get a psychological wound or a psychological injury, a wound to our mind.
Oh, so when you describe like attending that car accident when you were 17,
that
injured you psychologically, is that what you believe to happen?
Well, I don't know if it injured me in any significant way. I don't think it did. Not that one event in and of itself, but it's certainly a risk. It's what we call a potentially traumatic event because it involved seeing the loss of life. Because there were people where their lives could have been lost. That's known as having the potential to cause trauma. It's something significant that has the potential to overwhelm your ability to kind of understand it, to integrate it, to cope with it. But it's not necessarily the case that just because you're exposed to those things that you will end up with a psychological injury. And in fact, the normal response to potentially traumatic events is actually resilience.
Right, you grow from the experience.
Well, even if you don't grow from it, you're not psychologically injured by it.
Yeah.
And so
you less integrated and recover from it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You're able to just cope with the scene. You have the resources. We all have a level of resilience that we've built up through our lives through different coping mechanisms. And the good news is, for the majority of traumatic events we'll be exposed to in our lives, at least in the first responder context, we'll deal with those quite well. However, that's not always the case, right? Because we're all human. And just because we wear a uniform in the case of first responders doesn't mean that we're invincible or invulnerable. And those events, whether it's one event or accumulation of being exposed to those really difficult calls over the course of a career, that can actually lead to a psychological injury. Thankfully, most of the time it doesn't, but we have to be aware that it's a risk factor, just like anything else.
Okay, so heaven forbid you go to a suicide, particularly a young person.
Yes.
and that's could overwhelm you. That's conceivable, right?
Yeah, obviously there's some correlation between the severity of the potentially traumatic event and the risk for psychological injury. So you go to something like an infant fatality, you go to a suicide of an adolescent, those are obviously, on the high end of potentially traumatic. But again, just even if you go to one of those, it doesn't mean, okay, I've gone to the suicide, I'm going to end up with PTSD. That's absolutely not the case. Only really in recent history, the last 10, 20 years, we've really started to understand, because a lot of this understanding of trauma came out of the world wars and the Vietnam War, and a lot of it was focused around veterans, personnel in the military.
Like we had shell shock. What did that even mean? What were they thinking then, and what do we think now?
Yeah, well, so shell shock was this idea, right, that these behaviors that we see from people are a consequence of some physiological damage, right? So the concussion from the shells going off was actually impacting the biological organism and then leading to those outcomes. But then what they found is actually soldiers who hadn't been in artillery barrage were still breaking down. You're still having what we now call experiences of post-traumatic stress and have what we now call PTSD, or PTSD meaning post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people call it PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. Same thing.
And what are you doing here? So you're not integrating, you're not being resilient or even sometimes growing from it. You're actually going the other way.
Well, I mean, that's part of it. I mean, coming back to that idea of shell shock, what they initially thought was, all right, this is physiological. And then they realized, well, not everyone's been exposed to this concussion, and yet we're seeing other people break down. And the really sad thing about it was, well, the good thing was they realized that, okay, it's not just from concussion, it's not just physiological, there's a psychological element to it. But the psychological element they thought was a character element, cowardice. And so there were people tortured or I believe even executed.
You'd have officers behind the front lines shooting anyone who came backwards.
Exactly, right? And these people coming backwards, not because they're necessarily cowards, like they've got PTSD, they're experiencing extreme levels of trauma, they're psychologically wounded. And it was seen as a character deficit. And unfortunately, what they realized after a while, that even some of their most courageous men, and it was mostly men back then, were starting to break down after a certain amount of time in the field, And that is because the reality is, like, no matter who you are, you're human and you have vulnerabilities, and if you're exposed to enough of that stuff for a long period of time, of course it's going to have an effect on you.
I had this idea recently when I was reading some of the physiology around this stuff. It sort of took me back to my days in psychology, especially behavioral psychology, that
yes,
there's a sort of conditioning model, sort of evolutionary one, right? Like, so in the same way that if you try to, say, poison a possum with bait, but it doesn't actually kill it, it just gets really sick.
Right.
That one thing, it's never going to touch that bait again. It doesn't need multiple learning experiences to know that that's a bad thing.
Yes.
And even if it never sees that bait again for 10 years, it still won't like it. Just missing it won't make it go away.
Sure.
And I've heard similar descriptions in sort of acquiring the knowledge about events and fear and bad outcomes. So you get a single catastrophic experience. You don't need any more learning. There's some reasons that would be biologically deeply embedded. And again, it wouldn't just go away by doing nothing about it. And what do you make of that description?
Yeah, well, I mean, my background's not in that type of, behavioral psychology, but something that's certainly appears to be true is that, an experience of PTSD can be acute or chronic, so you can have someone who's exposed to a single event and it's so significant that it leads to a psychological injury like PTSD. But you can also have perhaps lesser events, but they accumulate over the course of time. And of course, this is the case with first responders. It's that repeated exposure to trauma that seems to be a real issue.
What's a bad outcome, and and I think you've done some of this yourself, what do you do to make this not go away and potentially make it worse?
Right, yeah. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I can speak to it personally. Like part of what led me to, apart from firefighting, into psychology and the research that I'm doing at AUT, or will be doing in the next couple of years, was my own experience with psychological injury. And for me, initially, that was anxiety. It was then depression, and finally suicidal ideation. And when I say suicidal ideation, I never planned to suicide. I never made a plan to do it. I didn't actually want to do it, but I'd been depressed for so long that I started to have thoughts like maybe that's the option there, which of course it should never be the option. But when you are so overwhelmed by depression and you don't see a way out, those thoughts can start to manifest. And so then the question could be answered in this way, like what were the things that maybe got me into that place in the first time, in the first instance, and what were the things that helped me out of that place, because I've been well for quite some time now, which is great. And that's where the hope is, right? Is that even things like PTSD, which is a really significant injury, people are recovering from and can recover from. And that's the great news, especially if we're aware of what to be on the lookout for, and we have some idea of how we can help people and calm ourselves and heal ourselves and be healed by other people, be open to getting assistance.
So just stepping back then.
Yeah.
Obviously, one way to avoid getting this is to avoid exposure to those events in the first place, but it's not really an option in your job.
Well, it's not an option in my job, and it's not an option in life, right? Because what led to my experience of anxiety and depression wasn't just the stuff I'd seen as a young, volunteer firefighter or a career firefighter. It was also, some stuff from my childhood that I hadn't acknowledged and worked through, relationship stuff, trauma, exposure to potentially traumatic events isn't the only thing that can contribute to, psychological injuries, obviously.
And so am I hearing you say that you expect adversity to be a natural part of a normal life?
Of course, we're all going to lose people that we care about. We're all going to go through, difficult times relationally, or at least the majority of us are. So it's not just about the exposure to what we call critical incidents, that first responders often go to. You don't have to be a first responder to go to a critical incident, right? Truck drivers come across crashes all of the time. Every time there's a house fire, there's often neighbours who are going to respond and be exposed.
So what did you do then that meant you didn't adapt?
Well, what I didn't do was I didn't really talk. Well, first of all, I don't think I had a very high level of mental health literacy. So if I look at some of my behaviour back then, like the way I was acting out, the way I was treating other people, the way I went about relationships, looking back now, having a high level of kind of mental health literacy, I go, well, there's your symptoms. Like something's going on there, mate. Like there's something that needed addressing. But back then I was, ignorant. I just thought, I was self-referential. I had no kind of level of objectivity to step outside of myself and go, hey, this doesn't seem quite right. Like how you're acting, how you're behaving, how you're feeling. Can we bring some curiosity to this and explore what's going on there? So that's one thing, right? I didn't have a high level of mental health literacy.
And you see that now when you're offering peer support to younger firefighters.
Yeah. If you're not aware that there's an issue, then there's not a lot you can do about it. Like that's where you've got to start, with some level of awareness of, hey, something doesn't seem quite right. That can be quite hard to do for yourself. And that's why it's good to be informed around, mental health and trauma issues, because then you can be out there looking out for other people and picking up on the signs and signals.
Yeah. What role does alcohol have to play?
Well, I think that's certainly, like we talk about adaptive and maladaptive coping mechanisms, which are just these fancy terms for, fancy psychological terms for good ways of coping with stress and trauma, and bad ways of dealing with, stresses and traumas. And so the way I think about adaptive versus maladaptive coping mechanisms is, generally speaking, for me at least, adaptive coping mechanisms are things that can be hard to do in the short term. So it's like, especially as a guy, it's hard to say, you know what, I'm going through a tough time at the moment, I need some help. Like it's hard to be vulnerable and push into that. And so there's difficulty. But actually over the long term, if I do that, if I turn towards, my pain or the difficulties that I'm experiencing, and I share that with someone else, doing that, and we know this from the research, that social support is going to be, on one hand, protective, and also if I am already psychologically injured, it's going to help me with my recovery. So difficult in the short term because it involves some vulnerability, but in the long term, really good for me. Maladaptive coping, kind of the opposite. Easy in the short term. Like it's easy to have a whiskey and Coke and dampen some of those intense emotions or fears. But in the long term, especially if I keep doing that, it's not going to resolve the issue, and potentially it's going to make it worse. So does that make sense? You know, that difference between, yeah. So I definitely did that. I did the drinking, you know, I did the partying. You know, it was kind of like a full term towards hedonism, you know, like, I've solved this problem just by ignoring it, having fun, you know, drinking. It's not like I consciously thought about doing those things, but there was just a natural kind of movement into that. And the thing about maladaptive coping mechanisms, whether it's drinking or partying or whatever, not that partying is always bad, like you can have a good time, but when it's to run away from your issues, then that's it. There's this great story that this Irish philosopher tells, or analogy, and he says, you know, over in Ireland, you know, you had a tough week and there's like a pub on every corner, you know, and so you go down to the pub and you grab a pint with your mates and you talk about all the shit that's happened in your week, you know, but it's actually adaptive, and you're going through it and you're turning towards it, and it's being facilitated by a drink, but hopefully not a whole bunch of drinks. And, you know, you do that, and then by 1 a.m., you know, they've broken out the fiddle and there's dancing, you know, you've turned towards it, and on the other side of it, you know, there's this joy, where he says you talk about the Western concept of partying, at least in the modern sense, and it's like preload, you know, get pretty drunk before you even go into town, then go into a club where the music's just drowning out any thoughts, you know, the alcohol's drowning out any feelings, you know, and it's all just about, I've got to be happy, you know, I've got to be at this heightened level of ecstasy, you know, I'm going to stay away from all the shit that's actually going on in my life.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one way to think about it. I really like.
And so one thing that was interesting to me, when you look at first responders, that's a broad category of people, their incidence of things like problematic drinking and drug use is actually much, much higher than in general society.
Yeah, well, we don't know, unfortunately, here in New Zealand what the case is, but from the studies we know of overseas, like there was a study in the US that found that alcohol dependence for male career firefighters in their sample was, I think it was around 30%. Okay, 30% of those firefighters screened positive for alcohol dependence. And you might just think, maybe that's just the state of things over in the States at the moment. But actually the general population estimates were only around 3 to 5%.
Yeah, so it's 7 to 10 times higher than the population.
Absolutely. So again, like what I was talking about before, maladaptive responses to mental health or to psychological injury is actually really understandable, because anxiety sucks. You know, depression is incredibly enveloping. So of course you're going to try and find ways to alleviate the distress, alleviate the pain. So it's no wonder that you see in a first responder context where they've been exposed to really difficult scenarios, like on the daily, that you're going to see an elevated level of using alcohol to deal with it, you know? And if that's all you know in terms of dealing with, you know, those traumatic events or the pain in your life, then it's pretty understandable, you know? It's what I'd do if I didn't know better.
Yeah, which you did.
Yeah, I did do it, you know, and at my worst, I can still get caught up in that. That's the thing. You've got to, it's not like you get to a point where you've just nailed it and solved it. You regress sometimes. I've got plenty of maladaptive coping mechanisms, as I'm sure you do at times. Yeah. In fact, both of us indulged a little bit over the Christmas period, so we're having to come back to some good, healthy, you know.
Oh yeah. So for everyone out there, what Josh and I do at the moment is we're providing some social support. Josh is going to get married in five years' time. I want to do a half marathon, and so we've committed to supporting each other on a nutritional journey. I'm prone to beer and chips. Josh is, I don't know what you're prone to.
Overeating?
Yeah, overeating in general.
I blame it on the fire service, actually. The meals they cook, mate. It's shit.
Yeah, and now you're on a less active job. You're worried that you'll just go worse.
Yeah, I'm just a disc jockey now, mate.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So we'll tell you how we went. Hopefully, all right. Okay. So the other thing that I learned from you is you'd been exploring the literature and where the evidence was in your postgraduate studies in trauma, and you pointed out that actually for your group of first responders, one of the main protective effects is having organizational support. Can you tell me about that whole thing? Because that's a really interesting idea, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we back it up, talk about, so I've got this experience of psychological injury myself, anxiety, depression, leading to suicidal ideation and coping with it really poorly. Like, what are the things that help? Was one, a growing understanding of, these behaviors or these outcomes aren't normal. Understandable, right? We don't want to judge the stuff. We want to bring some curiosity. Understandable given, like, looking at some of my childhood stuff and some of the unprocessed stuff, the trauma exposure, but not good for me. But what were the other things? It's like, well, social support was a huge part of me getting out of that place. And that looked like me reaching out to another firefighter and saying, mate, I'm not coping here. I'm struggling. And him, he wasn't a psychologist, he wasn't a counselor, but you don't have to be. He just was there to support, provide connection. We know that connectiveness, that social support, which doesn't necessarily look like a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and in some cases, at least early on, it's best not to be, is incredibly helpful. I was also connected to a clinical psychologist through my family, through my local GP, and we went on a bit of a journey together of exploring, like, how have I found myself, like, I'm a young guy, I've got lots of lifestyle factors that are going for me. I exercise, I eat pretty well, but I've still found myself in this place. What's going on here? And so that's an adaptive way to cope with stresses. Actually, they talk about problem solving, bringing a problem solving mindset to these issues. And so the combination of that social support, understanding that there was an issue, being connected up with a healthcare professional, and finding myself in a community that I felt I could be vulnerable with, and didn't feel too judged by, and incredibly important. So if we look at that individual experience and then extrapolate that out to, a larger group of people, first responders, a lot of it crosses over. So in the research on first responders and the things that contribute to their psychological injuries, 3 big factors. Obviously, the exposure to trauma doesn't help, this constant, repeated exposure to trauma. There's some firefighters, I spoke to an officer recently, he went to 8 fatalities, so eight incidents, or 8 medical calls that could have involved a fatality or did involve a fatality over 24 hours, right? Some members of the general population, you'd be unlucky if you're inside. Exactly, yeah. So that is the severity of the exposure. So obviously, that's a factor, this exposure to potentially traumatic events. And I think you're bringing this up early, why we call it a potentially traumatic event. If we ground that in a bit of a firefighter analogy, we don't call them traumatic events, even though they involve the loss of life and really difficult things, because if it was true that was the only variable that contributed to PTSD or something like that, what you'd see is 4 firefighters go to that call, all 4 firefighters end up with PTSD. But that's not what happens.
Even in the extreme example, so even with firefighters went to all 8 fatalities in 24 hours.
Correct. That's absolutely not a guarantee that they're going to develop PTSD, which is really good news. So there's obviously other factors that contribute to the vulnerability for PTSD than just exposure to that really difficult scene or scenario. And those other factors included stuff like, I call them like personal factors. So that might be adverse childhood experiences. It might be, your current relational status. Is there conflict in the relationship? Are you going through a divorce? It might be financial stress. Yeah, absolutely, financial stresses. If you're going through a divorce and you're having to pay for lawyers, there's this kind of accumulation of stresses that start to happen, right? Because you're losing a social support and a partner. You also don't have as much money, so that kind of needs not being met. And then on top of that, you're exposed to this traumatic event. Well, that's going to be, that individual's going to be more at risk than the firefighter, that things are solid at home, they're socially supported, they're well connected, financially they're in a good place. That's where those personal factors can be predictive or create. They can either be a barrier or facilitator to well-being. And then the other big factor, so we've got the exposure to trauma, which is a factor, the individual personal factors, the at-home stuff, which is a factor. And then the other big factor that we see in the research is what's seen as organizational or occupational stresses. So that's something we can all kind of relate to as well, not just first responders, like the majority of us who are working age are in employment. And our workplaces can have a huge impact on our well-being and our levels of resilience and vulnerability. So you know, if I'm a firefighter and I've got a boss and an organization that I feel has my back, incredibly protective, right? Because I can come to them and say, hey, I'm not coping, right? And I know they're going to support me. But unfortunately, the opposite is true. You know, if I have a perception that, you know, my manager doesn't care about me, my organization doesn't care about me or put my well-being, you know, as a priority, well, that's going to make me potentially less resilient. So there was a large study done in Canada recently, and what they found was, and you know more about this than me, with your research background, they can actually control for these different factors and see how much each of them contribute. And so they controlled for the exposure to trauma. And even after controlling for that exposure to trauma, they found that these organizational factors contributed even more to those outcomes, or were a significant contributor at the least.
Yeah, it's been so interesting coming on that journey with you. So
Yeah.
and then you talk about, there's two interesting words. You talk about cynicism,
Yes.
and then sometimes you talk about embitterment. What do you mean by that when you're cynical about your organization?
Yeah, well, it's just, we're trying to understand to what degree, if you don't trust your organization. So the thing that I study is, or the concept I study is known as perceived organizational support. And that's defined as the degree to which you feel as an employee, as a worker, that your manager, that your leader, and that your organization cares about your well-being and values your contribution. And another word for POS is trust. To what degree do you feel like you can trust your organization, you can trust your management?
Okay, but then if they say they do, because you know virtually every decent sized organization has a set of values.
Yes.
No one's going to say we don't care about you.
Yeah.
I mean, almost every organization is going to have a set of values that are something about caring about the well-being of their staff.
Absolutely, yeah.
But that's not what counts, right? It's about actioning that. And if they have that statement where they say, yeah, we really care about you, you're a number one priority, and they don't.
Yes.
Is that what you call cynicism?
Well, that's what we're going to explore in the research, you know. So we've got, in the research that we're doing, we've got a scale that accounts for cynicism and a scale that counts for embitterment. To what degree that's going to play out in the research, I'm not exactly sure, but it kind of makes intuitive sense, right? Is that if you feel like your organization doesn't care about you, or you feel like your organization makes promises but then doesn't act them out, you're going to be cynical. You're going to be less trusting than you would be if you saw your organization say you're the most important thing, and then your interactions with organizational leadership actually demonstrated that. You know, if you see an incongruence between what people say, I mean, this happens in, you know, if I tell you, Grant, hey, I'm going to give you some accountability, and I promise to do that, and then I don't follow through with that, then you're going to be a little bit more cynical, potentially, a little less trusting of me in the past, and hopefully you got a bit of grace, right?
Well, but I mean, in any large organization, it's hard to not be a little bit cynical because it's, you know, things are going to fail, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's different than embitterment. If I get this right, just tell me I've got this wrong. So I'm a bit cynical about the organization. I think there's a bit of a mismatch between what they say they do and what they actually do, but then actually something bad happens to me and they really don't act on it. In fact, I feel they've harmed me from it. Is that what embitterment is?
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of the those as scientific measures, I'm not 100% sure. You know, obviously we're working with Professor Robert Eisenberger and his team. Like, funny story, you know, like I'm really interested in this concept of perceived organizational support and how improving that sense of trust and connectedness might improve outcomes for first responders, given that we can't reduce exposure to trauma, or there's very little we can do about that. So I'm like, what are the things that can help there? I did this study on suicide and psychological injury and maladaptive behavior within my organization. And off the back of that, I was like, well, these organizational factors, that's something we can do about. Found this concept of POS coming up in the literature. So I just tracked this guy, Professor Robert Eisenberger, this like world-renowned researcher, down on Google, and find a number on there. And I just like called the number, went through to some, you know, answering machine, didn't think I'd ever hear anything else about it. And then suddenly I get a phone call a couple of hours later from a US number, and there's Professor Eisenberger, you know, how can I help you? And so laid out the situation, how I thought POS might be a factor, and he was all in. And I think that was over 2 years ago now, and he's working, him and his team are working with us on this project that we're doing. So
You know, I've been affectionately naming that effect the Joshosphere.
Joshosphere,
People will get pulled in by your enthusiasm and into a project.
Suck everyone in. So, I'm obviously not an expert on all of the elements that make up the survey, but I've been really committed to pulling in the best people, including yourself, from around the world to contribute and bring the expertise. And I see my role as bringing that, 16, 17 years of operational experience, along with this kind of keen interest in psychology, my own experience with psychological injury, and more recently the study and research in trauma.
So I guess just to let people know, I think, well, I'll give you my perspective, see if you agree with this, that what you've managed to do while you were career firefighting, going to fires and medical calls and training and everything else that you do with a shift-based system, and fishing the ocean out, you've managed to do some postgraduate study and then apply through a international grant process that Movember, the Men's Health Charitable Trust, put out around the health and wellbeing of first responders. I think there was 100 or something applications worldwide, and they funded like 15 or 14 or 16 or something. What was that?
Yeah, so there's a few things. It kind of started off the back of working through and getting to a better place psychologically. I think part of that journey is then wanting to help other people. And so as I grew in my kind of capacity to be vulnerable, I started sharing like what I was going through with some of my mates. And what you find is up until that point, it's quite isolating. You're like, I'm the only person in the world feeling this intensity of anxiety or hopelessness, in terms of depression. But as you open yourself up to telling other people about it and being vulnerable, you find that you're not alone. And in fact, a number of my friends were going through similar things, and in some ways they're probably relieved to hear, they weren't alone in it. So I started to go, okay, this isn't just me, this is other people, which is a little bit reassuring. I mean, sucks that it impacts more than one person, but that's the reality. And then as I continued the journey, I got involved with peer support, which is this concept of, within first responder organizations especially, of peers being there for peers, firefighters helping firefighters or police officers helping police officers. And through that work, I started traveling around Auckland and also around the country later on, and finding that actually these experiences seem to be spread throughout the country. Sometimes a result of trauma exposure, sometimes a result of stuff that was happening at home, relationship breakdown or whatever, most often probably a combination of those things. But I started to be quite concerned. It's like, hey, this seems to be a real issue, and I'm not sure we're on top of it. I got in contact with some local universities. I came across the program of violence prevention and trauma recovery at AUT that was run by Warwick Pudney and Helen Curran at the time. I owe a lot to them. And I started doing a postgraduate diploma in that area of study. I got a firefighter scholarship to explore those issues of suicide and psychological injury in my organisation. And Warwick actually talked me into it. Initially, I just thought I'd get a university on board, they'd do it all, and I will have done my piece, but he said, no, you come and do this, bring your operational experience and lens into this, combine it with some research and some higher level understanding around trauma, and then let's see where we end up. We do all of that. I do my study, I complete the postgraduate diploma, and then I just carry on, obviously researching and looking into those issues. And then I come across this opportunity from Movember, right? So Movember being a very large men's health charity, I think they were initially known for prevention around cancer, like testicular and prostate cancer for men, but now also around the mental injury side of things and depression and anxiety in men. And they are really interested in helping first responders and veterans as well, which is really cool. And so they had this initiative to help firefighters, police officers, combat veterans, emergency ambulance services, because they know, and we know from the research, that this is a really prevalent issue around the world, that you see first responders impacted at higher rates than the general population by these psychological injuries. And so they funded this international scoping review, and the idea being, what we need to do is identify suicide prevention programs and mental ill health prevention and recovery programs that work, identify where they are in the world, and then scale them. Make sure that if it's working here and it's making a real difference and it's reducing, prevalence of these things or reducing the symptomology, that everyone gets that benefit. So they funded an international scoping review of those things. Unfortunately, what they found was that there were no evidence-based programs.
So evidence-informed?
Evidence-informed, and maybe you want to speak to the difference between something that's evidence-informed and evidence-based?
Yeah, so it seems like a good idea. It should work, that there's a bunch of things coming together, either biological or epidemiological, that would say that would be successful, but
yes,
actually hasn't been tested.
Yeah, or it might have been tested in a certain context or on a one-on-one basis, but it hasn't actually been tested in the way that it's being implemented, in a group context or within a specific organization. So there's lots of programs out there, but the publicly available, and maybe there's some that there is evidence for, but the publicly available evidence isn't there to show that those programs are evidence-based.
They also identified that the organisational support was potentially a major factor that hadn't been investigated.
Yes, well, that was in a different study actually carried out by Don McCreary, who did the scoping review, or at least he was part of that, and that was looking at Canadian protective service occupations, I think, and that's where they found that. So Movember then has to pivot and go, well, actually, rather than going straight to expanding these programs, we actually need to evaluate the programs that are already out there or design new programs that actually we can show create these outcomes that we want to see.
And you've designed one around fire and emergency in New Zealand. You've designed one which looks at the organisational factors, and you're hoping that that's going to show some positive effects on wellbeing.
Yeah, so my interest was there's lots of ways you can kind of attack the antecedents of psychological injury. You can look at it from individual and group levels, and I guess from my research, I was more interested in the organisational contributors to those outcomes, and that's why when that opportunity came up, I thought, well, that's potentially where the gold is, right? Like, again, we can't do much about the trauma exposure. There's limitations about what we can do about the personal factors. Like fire and emergency certainly provides assistance for even stuff outside of the job. Like if you're going through a relationship issue, there's EAP services that are paid for by the organisation. And I know that's true for most first responder organisations. But actually, what about these organisational factors? Like the perceptions of leadership, the perceptions of trust, the perceptions of value. That seems to be something that isn't as tapped into. And we know now that it's a really significant factor. So yeah, they put out, you have the opportunity to apply around the world for this funding. I think they put up about $10 million in funding to do evaluations of programs. I think there was 150 ish programs or letters of intent put in, got down to the last 50, put in a full submission. And then, yeah, we're fortunate enough late last year to get an email saying, hey, you've been selected from, I think it's 7 or 8 different countries around the world to have this funding, to develop this program and to evaluate it robustly and see if we can make a difference. So our program is actually called the Whanaungatanga program. Whanaungatanga being this Māori word that loosely translates to, I guess, connection, relationship, whaka whanaungatanga and whanaungatanga, the building and maintaining of relationship, the building and maintaining of trust. And for me, that's the kaupapa that this project's really interested in, is how can we identify the things that violate trust, that violate relationship, as well as the things that contribute to trust and relationship, and obviously minimize, eliminate those factors in an organization that violate trust and relationship, and provide further resourcing for the things that build those concepts. So yeah, we're obviously at that stage, or around that stage, I got in contact with you. And so now AUT is involved in that endeavor as well, which I'm really excited about.
And we've got a good few years of really working on that. So we're looking forward to seeing what can happen.
Absolutely. And who knows what's going to happen. But what's been really encouraging is obviously when we got down to the last stages of the submission, I had to, I can't financially administer the grant. And so approached my organization, and yeah, they were really supportive.
And they've been even more supportive.
Yeah, and jumped on board. Like, I mean, there's probably some reservations, like it's just like it's difficult for an individual to be vulnerable and
take feedback.
And to take feedback and to go, hey, maybe not everything's right in my life. But I'm sure for organizations, that's a difficult thing to do as well, to say, you know what, maybe we're not as good as we could be. However, if we really want to live out these values, we're going to have to be open to, maybe not measuring up in some areas, not so that we can just have a dig at the organization, but so we can actually work with the organization to change that. And I think, unfortunately, some organizations avoid that altogether, or aren't open to that, or are too afraid of that. Thankfully, my organization, despite what the vulnerability that's going to entail, they've been up for it so far. So it's really encouraging.
All right, I want to finish by exploring 3 topics.
Yeah.
The first is, and let's just riddle into these. The first is dualistic versus non-dualistic thinking. This is a big topic for you. What is that?
Yeah, that's quite the switch. Well, I'm interested in psychology and interested in philosophy, and so that's more of the philosophical branch of my interest. But it's this concept of different types of thinking. And so dualistic thinking, and I guess I've garnered a lot from a philosopher, Richard Rohr, a theologian, and he talks about these concepts of dualistic thinking as being either or thinking, looking at an issue and saying it's either this or either that. In the context of first responders and looking at trauma, it was like, well, it's either the trauma exposure that contributes to those outcomes, or it's the personal issues.
Or even in society, it's you're vaxxed or not vaxxed. So what side are you on?
Yeah.
Every time there's been an issue in humanity, it tends to go to that binary.
Yeah. You're exactly right. It's a very binary way, black and white way of thinking, right? And it's not that there shouldn't be any space for binary thinking. When I get to an intersection, it's a binary decision. Do I go left or do I go right? But when you get to matters of greater complexity, what we find is that's quite a limited lens to try and sort through those issues. So, we look at quantitative research. We know if you do a univariate analysis, that's going to be frowned upon, right? Because there's all these other potential factors that are contributing to those outcomes. And if you're just doing a univariate analysis, you're not accounting for those other factors.
That's why we have a multivariate analysis.
And then you need to have a multivariate analysis. So in a research sense, you could think of non-dualistic thinking as both and. We're going to include all of the variables or at least more variables than just one or the other that could contribute to this.
So tell us about the idea of your On the Other Hand podcast.
Oh yes, I've had this idea for a while of the, and in part it's come because of my frustration with my own ways of interpreting things dualistically at times, being quite stubborn and only seeing things in a black and white way, but also organizationally. And then you see it in society. It just seems to be so prevalent in society that people are so binary in their thinking, so black and whether it's politics, whether it's religion, like there's no space for nuance, there's no space for complexity. And that's the antithesis of non-dualistic thinking or wisdom thinking, I guess you could call it. So yeah, on the other hand would be to look at an issue and say, well, on one hand, this is how we could look at it. But on the other hand, this is the flip side. And you see this in some philosophy. Like I quite like the concept of that came from Hegel, and then Johann Fick developed it further of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? So you have a hypothesis, so you have a thesis. Well, it's going to have holes, it's going to have errors. So actually, the best thing, if you are interested in getting to the truth, is actually to have that tested. For there to be
that is the whole idea of the scientific process, right?
Yeah, you have a hypothesis, then you test it, and that's an antithesis.
Yeah.
And through that process, what you want to get to is a third something, which doesn't necessarily negate all of the thesis or all of the antithesis. It actually combines, the truth. It takes elements of truth from both those things. So for me, like that's a level of thinking that I want to bring to these issues, whether it's politics or religion or trauma, is like, let's not just look at this in a really dualistic, simplified way, which is easy. Like it's nice to do. It's what I tend towards because it's simpler. It doesn't give me a headache. But in the end, it's probably not going to get us as close to truth as bringing a non-dualistic approach.
Right. And other fields like nutrition, you see this all the time, right?
Right.
Vegan,
well, you
not, or fat, saturated fat versus not, or
right. Yeah.
And of course, there's just nuances all over the place, right?
Yeah.
So the truth is not like that.
Yeah. So you get people who are fully in one camp or fully in the other camp.
Yeah.
And I think, I get a bit nervous around people who are fully invested in one idea. Not that it's bad, because I'm fully invested in the idea of, understanding trauma. But I hope that I come to my understanding of trauma with some openness, that I could be wrong, that there are facets of it that I don't understand. And there is, I like the Buddhist idea of the beginner's mind, like you could study trauma for 50 years and still, if you bring the right attitude, go, you know what, I know barely nothing about trauma.
Okay, so you mentioned a fellow called Richard Rohr. You mentioned him earlier, but I want to switch into the next topic, which is the idea of growth, but also his idea of the only way to grow is through adversity. What do you make of that whole philosophy, and where does it, and what is it about?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big things I've taken from him and the work that he's done around the world is that, firstly, we need to come with an openness and this concept that part of the truth isn't the whole truth. But further to that, when he comes to this concept of adversity and trauma and pain, what he talks about is, or I've heard him quote before, is this concept that whatever pain we don't acknowledge and transform, we eventually transmit, right? And that just makes intuitive sense to me, right? Whatever experiences, traumatic or painful that we experience in our life that we don't acknowledge and turn towards, those experiences are going to find their way out in some ways. And maybe they get internalized and then manifest as anxiety or depression. Maybe they get externalized and manifest as, kind of aggressive behavior or, these kind of relationship issues. But if we're not attuned to that, to our pain, to our trauma, if we don't have any awareness of that, and if we also don't know how to process it, unfortunately, the outcome of that is likely going to be some type of pathology. You could think about it I think about it like this sometimes, I get eczema, and I think in part dairy products, consumption of dairy products contribute to it. And I could get really annoyed about my eczema, but actually my eczema is a symptom of something underlying it, right? Which is an allergy towards, an allergy to something. So actually the eczema, if we conceptualize it that way, is that helping me? It's saying, hey, there's something that you're ingesting here that's not helpful.
Yeah. So you could rub a steroid cream on it. That's not necessarily, that's just going to hide it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what I like about Rohr and what he attempts to do with the center of action and contemplation, which is, actually we should talk about that concept of action and contemplation, but just to stick with this for the moment is like, right, depression, anxiety, are they signals? Are they symptoms of things? For a long time, as you know, things like depression was just seen as some biological imbalance. But now we know from the evidence that that's not the case, that actually trauma is a contributor. The adversities in our lives, and especially in childhood, are contributors, right? So then we can look at things like anxiety
and childhood, especially because we don't have a sophistication and coping strategies. So thoughts in childhood are more likely to not processed. And
how's a child, who may not even be at a verbal stage, able to acknowledge and process trauma that they're exposed to? At least as an adult, at least as a teenager, I could still do something with that experience. I could still verbalize it to someone, even if it wasn't in a sophisticated way. Whereas the child, they don't even have that function available to them. So what's the only option available to them? Probably repression, and so
that eventually comes out somewhere.
It's going to come out somewhere down the line. At least that's what that statement gets to. Same thing. But what that helps us do, right, is it brings hope, because it says actually my depression, anxiety, and I don't want to minimize those things. And I know I've been in those places, right? So this isn't minimizing it, but those are symptoms of potentially something in your life that needs addressing, and the hope is, if I address this, there'll be an alleviation of the symptoms that are manifesting as a consequence of it not being addressed and not.
But Rohr would say that not only would it be alleviated, you actually grow and be better.
Well, this is this concept of post-traumatic growth, that actually through adversity, if we do a good job of turning towards it and being attentive to it and healing it, not only can we gain resilience again, but we can actually grow from that experience. And you see this, right? You see this with people like Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you've read his
Jewish guy that was in concentration camp.
Concentration camps,
Yeah.
like that, some of the worst trauma you could be exposed to. And yet, the way he navigated that and found meaning in it meant that he became more human. He was able to give more back to the world, not from avoiding, exposure to life difficulties or life trauma, but by being able to do something meaningful with it, and growing from it. And so there's this phenomena within research now known as post-traumatic growth, which is not only can you recover and heal from trauma and psychological injury, you can actually come out better for it. There's things that and I can speak to that personally. It seems this can land the wrong way, but it belongs. Like my experiences of anxiety and depression, like if I hadn't had those experiences, I wouldn't find myself where I am now, getting to be involved in this like incredible research, getting to connect with people who are finding themselves in places that I were and being able to help them. So if it wasn't for those experiences and being able to actually process them and learn from them, I wouldn't have grown like I have now.
What does Rawls say about that? He actually says that these are inevitable in many cases, but actually also necessary to move life stages. And he says that everyone gets there.
Yeah.
It might be in the final few moments of your life, but preferably would be through other means earlier. What's that all about?
Yes, I mean, if you're interested in his work, he looks at this concept of the two halves of life and how, in the initial stages of, and you see this in some psychology as well, and sociology. In the early stages of life, a lot of it's self-referential and egotistical and all about my needs. But as we grow older, hopefully there's a maturation that occurs that helps us move outside of that. I've got a long way to go. I know in that area as well, but hopefully what it means is if we do that work well, that ego work well, when we do find ourselves in positions of power or influence, we're not going to abuse it, or we're going to be less likely to abuse it. So yeah, there's a necessary journey. He talks about how they do work in concepts of historical concepts of male rites of passage, for example, was one of the ways they dealt with. And so the idea, at least, that they speak to there is that historically, young boys were initiated, and they saw this cross-culturally into manhood. And there was these key concepts that the tribe or the village would help to integrate for the young boy. And that involved taking them out of their comfortable environment and putting them out in the wilderness for a time. And hopefully what that process did was actually help settle their ego, so they knew that life isn't all about me. I should be about life, and I should be about other people. I'm vulnerable, I'm not invincible. One day I'm going to die, And
you talk about those rules, about there's a number of those. Do you remember those? So one day I'm going to die. Life's not all about me.
Yeah, absolutely. That these were lessons that historically that they saw cross-culturally that the young boy would need to be initiated into or have a sense of, because otherwise they grow up, right, and think that life's all about me, that I'm invincible. And then if they do find themselves in a position of power, well, invariably the chances are they might abuse that power, or just use it for their own benefit at the cost of others. So yeah, I think that's an area that's worth investigating. I know that doesn't happen as much in society today. So now that we don't have those, at least in the Western world and in modern society, as much of those kind of programs of initiation or of what do we do here with ego development and how do we create...
Is ego development and initiation really just exposing that adolescent to adversity
well, I think
in a controlled way?
I think that's part of it. I think about it like this, if you think about resilience. If I go into the gym, if I want to, and you'll be able to tell me more about the biological physiology of this, but if I don't expose my muscles to a stressor, right? If I don't jump on that bench press, then to some degree I'm going to atrophy, right? And there's not going to be growth. By the same token, if I overload, right? If I overload my muscles, completely overload my muscles' ability to cope with that weight, that stressor, then I'm going to get an injury. So there's like this middle ground there where we want to be exposed to stresses. Like stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, they talk about you should actually delineate stress into distress and eustress. So distress or post-traumatic stress is, not healthy, whereas eustress is like, it helps me grow. So going back to that metaphor, I need some stress to help build the muscle. No stress at all, not helpful. Too much stress, I'm going to do an injury. So we've got to find and that's that dualism thing. The non-dualistic way is, what's the middle pathway here? We've got these two extremes. Can we negotiate some type of compromise, some type of middle ground? Where you're being exposed to a stressor, but you're being exposed in such a way where it's not completely overwhelming and won't lead to an injury, psychologically or physically. Yeah.
What do you like that term of the Centre for Action and Contemplation?
Yeah, I love this idea of, because we see it in the fire service and I see the parallels. So they have the Centre for Action and Contemplation, and the idea is that contemplation is really important. We need to think things through before we act, right? And so you'll see people who are contemplatively orientated, often researchers, deep thinkers. But the risk there, right, is that their whole life becomes about contemplation, and they don't act.
Like your idea of the podcast, you're contemplating it, but you haven't acted on it.
Well, yeah, I guess you're acting in some ways. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, I haven't acted it out. The idea's there and I've been thinking about it, but I haven't acted. So in some ways I'm actually, I'm imbalanced there. On the other hand, to steal the podcast name, we get people who are really action orientated, right? And they just want to do and change things and make things happen, but they haven't done enough of the contemplation work. So when they do act, it's not always good actions, right? So there can be an imbalance there. And the dualistic mindset would be like, oh, we just need to do contemplation or we just need to do action. And the non-dualistic way of looking at that is actually there's a relationship here between contemplation and action, and they should feed into each other, right? Good contemplation should lead to good action, and good action should lead to contemplation again, what worked, what didn't. And so in the fire service, that's something that's intuitively taught. When I did my training to be an officer, you go back down, and as a senior firefighter, it's a lot of it's action based, and so you turn up to these incidents, and all of a sudden, okay, crew, get in there. But if I haven't actually walked around that building, done a 360 of that building, I might have missed the fact that actually the best access was around the back, or there's patients around the back, and I've already committed my resources because I've just wanted to act in a way that hasn't maximized them. So,
but if you just walked around scoping it for the whole time, you would.
What's going to burn to the ground, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what they teach you down there is to do a rapid 360, right? Which is before you commit. If there's anything obvious that needs doing, of course do it. Like if there's someone, I'm not going to walk around the building if there's someone like lying down there straight away. So if there's a snap rescue to be done, let's get that done. But otherwise, what I'm going to do before I commit my resources and I commit to a strategy is I'm going to do a quick walk around that building or that incident to do some contemplation, to figure out what's going on here, with the understanding that that will be the best foundation to a strategy and an action. But like you say, if I spend an hour walking around that building, well, the thing's burned to the ground by the time I act. So there's this tension between contemplation and action. And that's what non-dualism is. It's like this openness to sitting with things being a bit unresolved, sitting with tension before we act.
Okay, last little switch of topic for Josh Darby is something that you're quite big on, I know, and actually when you more or less insisted I do a personality test called the Enneagram.
Yeah.
Both for my own insight, but for your insight. What's that about, and how do you get into that? And why is it valuable in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I've done a little bit of study and research on psychometrics, which is, again, psyche, that word's coming in there, the mind, soul, spirit, and metrics being measurement. So psychometrics being the measurement of those elements of the mind. And so there's two main domains of that. There's kind of and you'll see this a lot in recruitment for organizations. There's the psychometrics of cognitive ability, but there's also the psychometrics of personality. And so I'm more interested in the personality psychometrics. And there's lots of them out there. There's like Myers-Briggs, the Big Five, which is probably the most scientifically robust. Looks at things like conscientiousness and industriousness and extroversion, etc., neuroticism, etc. But one that's really resonated for me, it's not as scientifically robust, although there's been a recent meta-analysis done on it, which was really interesting, is the Enneagram. And I came across this in part through war. And it's a way of conceptualizing personality, 9 different personality types. And the concept is that we all have a personality type. While we encompass all of the 9 types, there'll be one that's like a home base for us. So there's the reformer, which is the one, there's the helper, which is number 2. There's the achiever, there's the individualist, there's the observer, there's the loyalist, there's the adventurer, there's the boss or the challenger, and there's the peacemaker. And so people listening to this, they're probably already starting to position themselves. But you can take a test and it gives you a sense of what is likely to be a home base for you. So I find that really interesting.
So for example, what I turn out to be the challenger, but with a subtype of achiever, which sort of works quite well for the work I do, right?
Yeah, well, you can have a number of types that come quite closely together. So your main type was an 8 on the Enneagram, which is the boss or the challenger. And we've definitely figured out, that seems to be true for you. But what I really like about it is this non-dualism it brings to personality. So there's not a hierarchy to the numbers. If you're a 9, you're not better than a 1. What the Enneagram says is actually there's a shadow side and a, I guess, healthy side to every personality, right? So I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, to give something away, which is the achiever. So at my best, I'm going to be pragmatic, and I'm going to be a bit of an efficiency expert, and I'm going to use influence and charisma to benefit not just myself, but other people, right? Those are some of the strengths of my personality type. However, at my worst, right, it's all going to be about me, and it certainly can be at times, and I have to be on the watch out for that. So it's going to be, a lot of it's going to be self-referential, and I'm going to have a propensity to exaggerate, right? So I catch a fish that's this big, and I'm like, it's this big.
Well, you do.
Actually, I already do this. If you get the right angle when you're showing a fish on the camera, you can make it look.
I've seen that.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Like, follow Josh on the.
I'm a master. An E3 is going to be able to nail that.
I wondered why you always have the fish like that.
Yeah. They're actually 5 pound, and they make them look 30. So
yeah, okay.
So that's something for the 3, right? That's our downfall. If we're not aware of that actually, here's the great things. Here's my potential in terms of that personality, but actually here's the downfall of that. Then there's not something to do.
Me on that is with that challenger one. At one end, that a life really well lived if someone is prepared to challenge and stand up for things was, I think, Gandhi.
Yes.
I thought, that's great, fantastic. And then look at the other end of it, pathologically, there's Hitler.
Yeah. I actually think that was for the 1, which is the reformer, right?
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Well, because you think about that, they're both reformers, right? So again, it's 2 sides of the same coin. And what a tool like that can help us do, at least in my assessment, anecdotally, is be aware of our shadow side. Carl Jung, a well-known individual within psychology, talked about this concept of the shadow side. And again, we come back to this concept of dualism. When we conceptualize ourselves or we conceptualize other people, do we think of someone like that person there's all good and that person's all bad? Or can we conceptualize people, including ourselves, as a combination of good and bad?
It just depends on the situation and how you.
Yeah. And I think that I think that for human flourishing and for politics and the trajectory of society, I think that's just such an important concept for us to grow on. Is like when we look at the other, realizing that they're just like me, a combination of shadow and light, and seeing that shared humanity and that shared struggle.
So I think they found that a valuable exercise. And then the second part to that is then you get your partner to do it.
Yeah.
And then depending on the where you get the interpretation of that, there's some good places. But one or two of them described how a sort of flourishing and thriving interaction will go on between those different personality types, and how what can possibly go wrong and when it can turn pathological. I found that very insightful, frankly.
Yeah. So once you know what your personality, and I think it's important to point out, you aren't your personality. You're more than your personality, but it's a big factor.
It's a guide to
it's a guide. Yeah. This isn't. Yeah. It's just another tool that, because we've talked about this concept of self-awareness being absolutely key. It's another tool that helps us with our self-awareness. So if you know your partner's number and your number, there's a tool there at the Enneagram Institute, and you can go on that website. I think it's www.enneagraminstitute.com, and you can look at those 2 numbers in relationship. It doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It might be in a business relationship, and they will articulate the problem points for those 2 personality types, but also the growth points. And I think that's the really important thing, is again, understanding that each number has this potential, each personality type has a potential to be realized, in a healthy way, but also a potential to really become quite pathological. So again, if we can have an understanding of, and again, those potentials are impacted by our life events, right? If I'm stressed out, or I'm traumatized, or I'm avoiding the shit in my life, I'm going to start heading down the shadow path of maladaptive behavior and pathological behavior. But hopefully with tools like the Enneagram, I can catch myself and go, oh, I'm starting to exaggerate. I'm starting to cover up my failures. I'm going in a path of disintegration rather than integration. It doesn't always work, because sometimes I like to go down that path for a while before I flip it around, even now. But I have been able to catch myself more as a consequence of realizing these are the ways I tend to, as a 3, I tend to undo myself and find myself in in my shadow self rather than my true self, And that's something we'll talk to about it as well. We've all got this true self. None of us live out of that place every single day, but it's something that we can move towards, and start to live more out of our true self than our false self or our shadow self.
Yeah, and religion has traditionally taken a lot of that role to help people, but I think as society has changed, that's probably no longer the case, and there's other tools that are evolving to.
Yeah, I think unfortunately what you've seen with a lot of the religions, at least, is they've missed those. What I've found, at least looking at some of the monotheistic religions and large religions around the world, at their highest levels, a lot of them are saying the same thing, which is you have a true self, there is a false self, beware of the ego, live, forgive, have grace, don't just live for yourself, which is all really good stuff. But unfortunately, throughout time, we've had people involved in those or representative of those religions that haven't lived that stuff out, right? And that have operated from a place of unhealthy ego and from shadow. And that's created a lot of distrust, like just as it would in an organization. A religion is just a big organization, right? And so if you don't have leaders of organizations or religions who, like Raw talks about the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So orthodoxy is right knowing, orthopraxy is right practice, right? So I know a lot of things about certain subjects, but I don't always practice them. So I'm going to be limited. Same thing, you could know the right ideas, you could have you could be very orthodox, but if you're not actually practicing love and forgiveness and grace, then you're not actually going to represent those ideals very well, and there's going to be negative outcomes from that. And that's plagued religion, I think, most religions throughout history.
All right, Josh Darby.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, trauma, religion, politics.
Yeah, covered a bit of ground, but it's good. And we'll put a few of those links up at Enneagram, Raw's work and those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's important to end on is we've covered a lot of subjects here, and who knows what it might have brought up for people, but I think it's important to end these things by saying, that concept of hope is really important. My encouragement is to do what I did back then, and I still need to do at times, and that's when you're going through difficult times, reach out for help, go and have a chat to your GP, and let other people in, that when you're going through difficult times, it shouldn't be all up to you, let other people in to help. You can call 1737 to speak to a trained counsellor, right? So if there are some things that this has brought up, talk to someone. If you don't feel like you can talk to anyone close to you, jump on the text, jump on a phone call and yell out. Just look to connect, social support, have a chat to your GP. And I can promise you, at least from my experience, that there is a way out of those things, whether it's anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. Yeah.
You've been listening to Prevention is Cure, brought to you by precure.com, with me, Professor Grant Schofield. At Precure, we're developing a way to help medicine help change the world. We're filling that gap. We're helping train health coaches and mental health coaches. We're bringing short but effective behaviour change programs over 29 days to you to help you learn for yourself and help others as well be healthier. We're trying to create a community of like-minded people like you who want to use the latest science and practice to change lives for the better. Join us at precure.com. Get involved in our communities. We'd love to have you along for the ride. Precure.com.
Too many days in the darkness without a glimpse of the light. Running tired and broken and scared, but I swear I'll never give up the fight.